The Texas sun doesn't just set in Katy, it bleeds across the horizon, painting the wooden porch of my house in a heavy, suffocating amber. I sat there, the humid evening air pressing against my chest, staring at the old brass pocket watch my father left me. Its steady, rhythmic ticking used to bring me peace. That night, it just felt like a countdown. You see, no one prepares you for the moment you realize your wife is rooting for the cancer. Not the doctors, not the thin pamphlets they hand you at the oncology center with their careful, sterile optimism. There is no manual that teaches a man how to process the cold, hard fact that the woman who shared his bed for 13 years is quietly praying for a disease to do her dirty work. But Victoria wasn't just waiting for nature to take its course. She was impatient. Just days before my official biopsy results were even delivered, while I was still trying to learn how to breathe through the terror, she had already gone into my files. She quietly stripped my sister's name and legally altered the beneficiary on my corporate-linked insurance policy. She wasn't just preparing for a future without me. She was actively cashing in on my expiration date before the ink on my medical charts was even dry. It wasn't just a betrayal of the heart. It was a cold, calculated financial execution. This is Samuel Miller, and welcome to Dad's Ultimate Payback. I'm sharing this memory not out of bitterness, but because the truth deserves to be heard. Before we go any deeper into how this storm unfolded, please take a moment to leave a comment and let me know which state you are watching from tonight. And if you believe that quiet justice always finds its way home, hit that subscribe button. 13 years is a long time to build a life, and even longer to realize you were the only one holding the blueprints. I spent over a decade as a senior geological engineer, a profession that demands you look beneath the surface to find what is solid and what is bound to collapse. Irony has a cruel sense of humor. For years, my life was defined by the relentless rhythm of remote oil rigs in West Texas, working 70-hour weeks under a merciless sun that bakes your skin to leather. I endured the bone-deep exhaustion, the isolation, and the hazardous conditions because I had a vision of what it was all for. Every grueling shift on those steel platforms was a deposit into the life I wanted to provide for Victoria, and I provided it. When we moved to Katy, Texas, I made sure she had the brick mansion with the manicured lawn, the European luxury SUV sitting in the driveway, and a closet filled with designer evening gowns for the charity galas she loved so much. Victoria carried herself with a practiced, old-money elegance that commanded every room she walked into. I loved her with the quiet, unyielding devotion of a man who doesn't keep score. When she smiled at me across a crowded room, wearing a dress that cost more than a field worker's monthly wage, I told myself that the loneliness of the oil fields was a small price to pay. I thought she loved me. In reality, she just loved the security of Samuel Miller's bank account. Samuel himself was purely optional. The illusion shattered into a million jagged pieces on a rainy Tuesday morning in February. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's a string of syllables that completely empties the air from your lungs. My oncologist, Dr. Williams. A calm, precise man whose steady demeanor felt like an anchor in a Category 5 hurricane, walked me through the harsh reality of 6 heavy cycles of chemotherapy. I sat in that sterile leather chair, the low hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing in my ears, and I couldn't process half of what he was saying. My mind kept rushing back to our home, to my family. I wasn't afraid of the needles or the sickness. I was terrified of what this would do to the life I had built for my wife and our 7-year-old daughter, Lily. I felt the heavy, crushing weight of a provider who suddenly realizes his foundation is cracked. I drove home that afternoon with a hollow ache in my chest. I walked into our spacious kitchen, where the scent of rosemary and roasted chicken filled the air. Victoria was standing by the quartz countertop, pouring a glass of white wine. When I sat her down and spoke the word cancer, she dropped the glass. It shattered on the tile. Victoria cried real tears right there, her shoulders shaking as she threw her arms around my neck, holding me tight against the kitchen counter. "We're going to fight this together, Sam," she whispered fiercely into my ear. "I'm not going anywhere. You hear me?" I closed my eyes, breathed in her perfume, and believed every single word. That memory is almost funny to me now. What Victoria didn't know, and what she had completely forgotten in her haste to look past me, was a dusty legal folder resting in my safe deposit box. Before our wedding, my father, a cynical old land surveyor, had insisted on a strict prenuptial agreement regarding my professional assets. I was a young man in love and thought it was unnecessary, but I signed it to appease him. That document ensured that the full copyrights to my three-dimensional geodetic survey maps and proprietary subsurface imaging data. The invisible intellectual property that generated a massive, steady stream of corporate royalties every single month remained solely my separate property. It was a golden nest egg that Victoria had dropped hints about for a decade, a fortune she desperately wanted to absorb into our joint accounts, but its legal structure remained entirely out of her elegant reach. It was the one piece of my world she couldn't touch, and as my health began to fail, her eyes began to wander toward other ways to secure her future. The betrayal didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It built up slowly, one quiet, agonizing brick at a time, until the wall between us was too high to climb. The first major shift happened just 3 weeks into my diagnosis. Victoria sat me down in the living room, her expression a mask of maternal concern, and told me she had decided to send Lily to stay with her mother in San Antonio. She used careful, logical arguments. The chemotherapy would be brutal. The house would become a depressing place, and a 7-year-old child didn't need to witness her father deteriorating. I nodded numbly and agreed. I thought she was protecting our little girl from the trauma of watching me wither away. It took me months to realize the devastating truth. She wasn't protecting our daughter. She was clearing the house. With Lily gone, the silence in our home became deafening, and the space left behind was quickly filled by a shadow. Exactly 16 days after my first treatment, a man named Julian entered our social orbit. He was a wealthy, slick investment broker Victoria had met at a museum gala months before my diagnosis. A contact saved quietly under a generic business name in her phone. Now that I was conveniently weak, bald, and preoccupied with the exhausting task of trying not to die, Julian became a frequent topic of conversation. First, he was just a financial advisor helping with the portfolio. Then he was a family friend checking in. The changes in Victoria grew more pronounced during my grueling sessions at the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. In the beginning, she drove me there. She sat in the chair beside my treatment bed, flipping through magazines. But by the third cycle, she started arriving late. Then she stopped coming altogether, sending cold, brief text messages instead, stuck in a portfolio meeting. "Babe, you've got this!" I would sit in that vinyl chair for 6 hours straight, the toxic yellow chemicals slowly dripping into my veins, entirely alone. I watched the other patients in the ward. They had people beside them. Spouses holding their hands, sisters bringing them warm blankets, friends telling stupid jokes to pass the time. The chair next to Samuel Miller remained empty, session after session. The only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical beep of the IV pump. When Victoria was home, her presence felt more distant than her absence. Her phone, which used to sit openly on the coffee table, was suddenly always face down. She began taking it into the bathroom, locking the door behind her. I would lie in bed, my body shivering from the after effects of the drugs, and hear her muffled, unguarded laughter echoing from the hallway. A genuine, light-hearted laugh she hadn't given me in years. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching the local news, I reached over to take her hand, seeking just a fraction of warmth. The moment my fingers brushed her skin, she flinched. It was a slight, instinctive pullback, the involuntary reflex of a person touching something they find deeply unappealing. I noticed every single thing. Chemo ravages your flesh, but it leaves your mind terrifyingly sharp. But I wasn't the only one watching the empty chair. Somewhere around my 4th session, Dr. Williams stopped looking only at my blood charts and started looking at me. His clinical questions shifted. "How is the support system at home, Sam? Are you managing to eat 3 meals a day? Who is driving you home after these high-dose sessions?" His voice was perfectly professional, but his eyes held a heavy, knowing sadness. He had seen this exact story play out 100 times before in his career. One afternoon, after a particularly rough treatment, he quietly slipped a business card into the pocket of my coat. On the back, written in his precise handwriting, was the name of a high-profile family law attorney who specialized in protecting the estates of terminally ill patients. Dr. Williams didn't say a word about it, and neither did I. He simply squeezed my shoulder and walked out. It was a silent, devastating confirmation of the shame I had been hiding from myself. The medical world saw my isolation clearly, even while I was still trying to convince myself that my wife was just tired. I was being erased while I was still breathing. It was a sweltering Thursday afternoon in late March when the ground beneath my feet completely gave way. My white blood cell count had dropped dangerously low, forcing Dr. Williams to cut my treatment session short and send me home early. Since I had long stopped expecting anyone to wait for me, I quietly called an Uber. The ride back to Katy was entirely silent, the heavy Texas heat humming against the windows as we pulled into my driveway at exactly 2:30 p.m. I let myself in through the front door, the house feeling deceptively quiet until I stepped into the carpeted hallway. That's when I heard it. Victoria was in the kitchen, and she was laughing. It wasn't the polite, guarded laugh she used at charity galas, but a loose, uninhibited sound. The kind of laugh she hadn't shared with me in years. I stood frozen in the shadows, my jacket still on, the plastic hospital bracelet still tightly gripping my wrist, and I listened to my wife's voice carry clearly through the house. "Julian, honestly, I've basically been a widow for the last 6 months anyway," she said, followed by another soft chuckle. "Fingers crossed it wraps up soon. I just need him to sign the remaining asset transfer paperwork before it's too late." She wasn't whispering. She had completely stopped caring enough to even hide her voice. But the words weren't the only weapon that pierced through me that afternoon. Through the narrow crack of the pantry door, I saw her standing by the island, casually flipping through a stack of papers. Spread out on the quartz countertop were my official medical records from MD Anderson. Next to them was a forged set of documents. Victoria had been working with Julian to systematically alter my diagnostic codes and laboratory indicators on the insurance submittals, deliberately exaggerating the terminal nature of my illness to the underwriters. She wasn't just passively waiting for the cancer to claim my life. She was actively manufacturing a paper trail to accelerate the massive corporate life insurance payout before my heart even had a chance to stop beating. I did not storm into that kitchen. I did not call her name, nor did I demand an explanation. When you are a geological engineer, you learn that when a mountain begins to collapse, shouting at the falling rocks won't save you. You must find stable ground. I turned around silently, my heavy, work-worn boots making no sound on the carpeted hallway, and walked up the stairs. I entered the master bathroom, closed the door without locking it, and sat down on the cold gray tile floor, resting my back against the porcelain tub. The silence in that room was suffocating, broken only by the faint, distant hum of the Houston traffic outside. I didn't cry. My eyes remained perfectly dry, staring at the small plastic hospital bracelet still clinging to my left wrist. The yellow chemotherapy drugs were still actively moving through my bloodstream, making my head throb and my bones ache with a deep, strange heaviness. But sitting on that cold floor, something inside me stopped breaking and started building. I let the terrible thing I had been refusing to acknowledge become something I now absolutely, completely knew. My wife was not waiting to see if I survived. She was calculating the monetary value of my death. She had made her calculation. Now, with the cold tile pressing against my skin, I began the quiet, meticulous process of restructuring my mind. The cruelty, however, did not stop at that hallway. It reached its absolute peak exactly 2 weeks later. I returned home from a particularly grueling high-dose radiation session at MD Anderson, my body trembling with nausea, barely able to keep my balance. When I pushed open the front door, the smell of seared ribeye steak drifted through the foyer. I walked into the dining room, and my breath caught in my throat. There was Julian. He was sitting comfortably, completely unbothered and at ease, at the head of my dining table. He was eating off the antique silver plates that had belonged to my mother, using the crystal glassware I had paid for with months of isolation on the oil rigs. Victoria stood by the mahogany sideboard, her arms tightly folded across her chest. She didn't look guilty. She didn't offer an apology. Her face held the mild, cold irritation of someone whose scheduled flight had been delayed by an inconvenient storm. "Sam," she said, her voice dropping like a heavy stone into the quiet room. "You need to be realistic. Look at yourself. You might not make it through the next month, and you need to stop being stubborn. I have to think about my future, and I have to think about Lily. We need you to sign the full power of attorney and the asset transfer agreement right now. In the original script of my life, I might have expected Julian to look at his plate in shame. But arrogance has a way of blinding a man. Julian didn't stay seated. He stood up, towering over my frail, cancer-ridden frame. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive designer suit, looking down at me with the cold, predatory calculation of a man who believed physical health and financial dominance gave him the right to conquer another man's home. He stepped directly into my personal space, his shadow completely blocking out the dining room light. "Listen to your wife, old man," Julian sneered, his voice dripping with condescension as he lifted a heavy leather binder from the table. "You're a ghost already. Sign the papers and make it easy on everyone." With a sudden, disrespectful flick of his wrist, he shoved the thick stack of legal documents straight into my chest. The sharp edge of the binder dug into my collarbone, knocking me back a half step against the doorframe. Julian smiled, completely confident that a dying man had no fight left in him. He fundamentally misunderstood what he had just done. He thought the cancer had made me weak, but he didn't know what I used to do for a living. Before I became an executive, I was a field geologist in West Texas. I had spent my youth managing unstable underground mines, facing down brutal oilfield foremen, and dealing with volatile pressures that could blow a steel rig into pieces at any second. You don't survive 30 years in the deep earth by panicking when the roof starts to cave in. You become perfectly still. You look for the weakest structural point in your opponent, and you prepare the counter-strike. As the papers fluttered onto the floor around my boots, a gear inside me that had been grinding for months finally clicked into a permanent iron position. I looked past Julian's expensive suit directly into Victoria's cold eyes. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply memorized the exact layout of their arrogance. They thought they were burying a man. They had no idea they were just digging their own grave. The frame completely freezes on Samuel's face, his eyes shifting from a mask of physical exhaustion to a cold, razor-sharp focus in the dim light of the dining room. If you believe that a good man, when pushed completely into a corner, possesses a quiet strength that no amount of money or arrogance can ever break, please take a single second to hit that like button right now. Stand with Sam as we prepare for the ultimate payback. The dynamic of a storm changes completely when you are no longer standing in it alone. 2 days after that confrontation in my dining room, a worn-out pickup truck pulled into my driveway. Out stepped my little sister, Sarah. She is 39, the kind of Texas woman who will hug you until your ribs ache and then hand you a sharp legal strategy before you've even wiped your face. She walked into my kitchen, took one look at the half-empty plates, the sterile medicine bottles scattered on the counter, and the hollow look in my eyes, and she didn't ask permission. She simply set down 3 heavy bags of groceries, rolled up her sleeves, and said, "All right, Sam. Here is what is going to happen. I am driving you to every single session from now on. You are going to eat, you are going to rest, and we are going to fix this." All of it, for the first time in months, someone was actually looking out for me. Sarah became my fortress. Every 3 weeks, she was the one sitting in that vinyl chair next to me at MD Anderson, making sure I had warm blankets and ice chips, ensuring that the empty space beside my bed was never empty again. Dr. Williams noticed the change immediately. The heavy, professional silence in his eyes turned into a quiet nod of approval as he watched my sister fiercely manage my daily care. With Sarah handling my physical survival, she freed up the one thing I desperately needed to fight the other battle, my mind. While Sarah drove me to the medical center on weekdays, I spent my Saturday mornings sitting in a quiet, wood-paneled office in downtown Houston. Across from me sat Mike Dawson, a veteran family law attorney with 30 years of experience and a reputation for dismantling arrogance with surgical precision. I laid out every detail for Mike. He didn't get angry. He just listened, his pen moving steadily across his yellow legal pad, capturing only the facts that mattered. Victoria and Julian had grown breathtakingly careless, blinded by their own absolute certainty that a dying man was too weak to push back. They spoke openly in the house, made financial moves without covers, and treated my presence like a temporary inconvenience. They had no idea that every single piece of data was being systematically harvested. Mike and I spent those quiet months building a legal trap, using Victoria's own unbothered arrogance as the primary material. We documented the unauthorized attempts to alter my corporate insurance policies, the heavy withdrawals from our joint household accounts used to fund Julian's investment schemes, and the consistent, documented emotional neglect of a critically ill patient. The day we walked into the family court in Harris County, the air felt thick, but my chest was remarkably light. Victoria arrived with her high-priced attorney, carrying herself with that same elegant, unbothered smile, fully expecting to divide the empire I had spent a lifetime building. She thought she held every single card. She was about to find out she was holding nothing. Mike Dawson opened his leather briefcase and began laying out the reality of the Miller estate with the calm efficiency of a man reading a grocery list. First came the mansion in Katy. Victoria's attorney confidently claimed it as community property. Mike calmly slid the original deed across the table. Separate property, purchased entirely by me years before our wedding, with a legacy clause that had never been modified. The luxury vehicles? Tied directly to my consulting firm's corporate line, completely out of her reach. The joint accounts she had been spending so freely? Already legally frozen and repositioned due to fraudulent activity. Furthermore, every single one of my proprietary geodetic survey maps and intellectual property royalties had been legally transferred months prior into an ironclad, irrevocable trust solely for our daughter Lily, with Sarah appointed as the independent executor. Victoria's eyes widened as she watched her calculated future evaporate paper by paper. But the devastating blow, the piece that changed the entire room from a standard property dispute into a moral execution, did not come from a bank statement. It came from my father's old brass pocket watch. Victoria had noticed it sitting on the kitchen island for weeks, assuming it was just a sentimental piece of junk I kept close for comfort. She never realized that the vintage casing housed a high-sensitivity digital audio recorder that I had carefully activated every time I left the kitchen. Mike Dawson pressed play on his laptop. The sterile silence of the courtroom was instantly filled with Victoria's clear, unwhispered voice carrying through the speakers. The judge listened to my wife laughing with Julian about how I was basically a ghost already. The judge heard them discussing how the corporate life insurance payout would be massive and how they just needed to be patient because, fingers crossed, it wraps up soon. But the recording went deeper into a dark territory they never expected me to uncover. It captured Julian and Victoria openly plotting to withhold my secondary palliative medications, intentionally mixing up my post-radiation schedules to induce severe physical distress, hoping the physical exhaustion would force me to sign the remaining asset transfers out of sheer desperation. The silence that followed that recording was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my 60 years on this earth. The judge, a stern woman with decades on the bench, took off her glasses and stared at Victoria for a long, freezing moment. The elegant mask my wife had worn for 13 years completely collapsed, leaving her pale, trembling, and utterly exposed. The judgment was swift and absolute, citing gross marital misconduct, severe financial fraud, and active endangerment of a vulnerable spouse. The judge stripped Victoria of every single claim to the marital estate. She was granted absolutely zero alimony. When it came to our daughter, the court looked at the evidence of Victoria's priorities and granted me sole physical and legal custody, with Sarah maintained as the guardian ad litem. Victoria walked into that courtroom trying to execute a hostile takeover of a dying man's life. She walked out with nothing but the clothes on her back and a legal mountain of debt. The final piece of justice, however, did not happen within the marble walls of the courthouse. It happened at a high-end restaurant in the Galleria district later that evening. Victoria had immediately called Julian, desperate, frantic, seeking the shelter of the man she had detonated her 13-year marriage for. They sat at their regular table, but the atmosphere was completely different. Word travels fast in Houston's tight-knit professional circles when a high-profile asset fraud case drops. Julian had already reviewed the court's public filings. He listened to Victoria explain that the house was gone, the royalties were locked in a trust for a 7-year-old child, and the massive insurance payout was never going to come. A family friend of Sarah's happened to be seated 2 tables away, watching Julian's face go through its final, cold calculations. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't hold her hand. Julian simply placed his linen napkin down on the table, looked at the woman who had ruined her life for him, and delivered the final verdict of a predator who realized there was no meat left on the bone. "So, there's nothing," he said, his voice entirely flat. "Julian, please, we can still build," Victoria pleaded, her voice breaking in front of the quiet dining room. He didn't let her finish. He stood up, adjusted his coat, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving her sitting there completely alone under the bright chandelier with a heavy bill she could no longer pay. By the time she stepped out onto the sidewalk, the social world she had carefully curated through my income had completely closed its doors. The dinner invitations vanished. The phone calls stopped ringing. The country club acquaintances simply looked the other way when she passed. She had bet everything on my death. She had calculated the price of my grave while I was still fighting for air. And in the end, she was left alive in a city that knew exactly what she was. 4 months after the final gavel fell in that Harris County courtroom, I found myself sitting in the familiar, quiet office of Dr. Williams. He didn't slide a folder across the desk this time. He just looked at me over his glasses, a rare, genuine smile breaking across his precise features, and uttered a single word: remission. The scans were completely clean. The shadow that had been consuming my physical body was gone. I walked out into the bright Houston sunshine, took a deep, unrestricted breath, and realized I hadn't just defeated a biological death. I had survived a spiritual execution. I had conquered both the cells trying to destroy me and the malice of the person who was supposed to protect me. That same evening, the celebration wasn't grand or loud. It was small and real, the way true healing always is. We gathered on the back porch of my sister Sarah's house. Her husband, Ben, had the backyard grill going, the rich, smoky scent of Texas barbecue drifting through the warm air. My nieces and nephews were running through the grass, their joyful, unfiltered laughter filling the dusk in that beautiful, messy chaos of children who have no idea how much the adults around them have suffered. They were just happy we were all there. After dinner, Lily came over and climbed into the oversized wooden chair right next to me. She was holding a crinkled piece of construction paper, a drawing she had spent the afternoon working on. It was a picture of the two of us, rendered in messy crayon, standing together under a massive, deep blue Texas sky filled with bright, uneven stars. She didn't say a word. She just tucked her small hand into mine, rested her head against my chest, and within 10 minutes, she was fast asleep, her steady, peaceful breathing moving against my shoulder. As the crickets began their nightly chorus, the phone on the wooden armrest buzzed, its screen lighting up the dark. Victoria's name flashed across the glass. I looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. My heart didn't race. There was no anger, no bitter desire for a confrontation, no satisfaction in her ruin. There was absolutely nothing at all. The grief for Victoria had already been processed and buried on that cold bathroom floor back in March. I calmly reached over, turned the phone face down on the wood, and let the silence return. Looking up at that vast, starlit Texas sky, a profound realization settled deep into my bones. The cancer had never been a death sentence. It was a supreme, necessary purification of my fate. The universe hadn't sent the disease to destroy me. It had allowed the storm to arrive so that the parasites feeding on my life would finally be exposed and stripped away. It broke down a false reality to return me to my original, unadulterated value: a father, whole, unbothered, and entirely free. I was no longer surviving. I was busy living. The camera slowly pans out, capturing the soft, fading amber light of the Texas sunset reflecting in Samuel's calm, rested eyes as a gentle smile touches his face. Money, arrogance, and cold calculations can build grand castles, but they are always built on sand, destined to crumble when the tide turns. In the end, it is only quiet dignity, blood loyalty, and unconditional love that will keep a man standing through the darkest storms. Thank you for sitting on the porch with me and listening to my story here at Dad's Ultimate Payback. If you believe in the power of truth and quiet justice, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next memory next week. Until then, take care of your people and wish you all a peaceful night.